to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is a special guest, Dr. Harold James, who's the professor of history and international affairs at Princeton University. He's a specialist in German economic history and on globalization. He is an author of multiple books related to economy and to globalization and financial policy and ideas. And he is also a contributor to Project Syndicate. And his latest article called The Financial March to War discusses the potential collapse or the perception of the collapse of the international order and the new priorities emerging related to financial stability. We will be discussing the strategies, old and new, for tackling this time of uncertainty. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today. This is a fraught topic. We are hearing a lot of snippets related to concerns about what is happening today, but there is not necessarily a solid picture emerging from all of this, and certainly not from the many disjointed discussions taking place. But your background would be perfect to address both the potential strategies or lack thereof, and the very fact that so much is not really coming together in terms of even the polemics of it. Before we delve into this topic, could you tell us a little about your professional background, your interests, and how this thought realization occurred to you?
Well, it's great to be with you, and thank you so much for having me. Yes, indeed, I've been thinking about globalization, how globalization develops, the circumstances in which it is under threat, is vulnerable for a long, long time. And I started my academic life really working on the interwar period. And obviously that looks like the major precedent for the collapse of globalization. I mean, I think you can also think of the First World War as being a moment when globalization collapsed. And in the early 2000s, I wrote a book called The End of Globalization, which was not a polemic against globalization. On the contrary, but it was a warning of the circumstances in which you might turn away from this. Today, I think we're in a particularly vulnerable moment because we've got, on the one hand, enormous new technical opportunities, and we've seen it with the development of the vaccine during the COVID pandemic, but also in general, I think the development of AI is going at a just absolutely amazing speed. So there's all the technology that's taking place that in a way could link the world more together. But at the same time, there's a growing sense that there are security conflicts, and it's obviously highlighted in 2022 by the Russian attack on Ukraine. But now we have the conflict in Gaza after the Hamas attack on October the 7th last year. There's anxiety about Taiwan and about the South China Sea. There's anxiety about Iran. There are many, many flashpoints all over the world that can erupt. And so I think, what fascinates me is this interplay between the amazing technical possibilities and, on the other hand, the sense that from the perspective of many, many countries, the world is locked increasingly in a zero-sum game. So in a zero-sum world, if it's to your advantage, it's to my disadvantage, and the other way around. And we don't have that vision that was central, I think, particularly at the end of the Second World War, in the big conferences, in the United Nations conference at San Francisco, or the United Nations Monetary Conference at Bretton Woods that established the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The sense there was that peace and prosperity were indivisible, and the then US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau formulated it, I think, very, very clearly. address to the Bretton Woods Conference, this indivisibility of the peace on the one hand and prosperity on the other, and you can't have one without the other. And so if you think that you can just be peaceful in your little bit of the world, you're making a mistake. And in a sense, it's a criticism also of what the US was doing in the 1930s, because the United States was more and more pulling away from the world, and isolationist. It wasn't involved in the Second World War until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941.
So let's start from the beginning, and before we get into why all of this is happening and how it can be addressed, let's look at the terms. Let's look at what people understand when they're trying to wrestle with the big picture of these international forces, and try to understand how it came to be that after one of the major disasters of the 20th century, World War II, there was this understanding to try to solve problems jointly, and now everything seems to be going in the other direction. So what I'd like to start with is distinguishing between globalization and globalism in terms of these terms and understandings, because I see a lot of people using them interchangeably, and I personally don't think that's necessarily the case.
Yes, that's fascinating. I think you're absolutely right that the terms which we use to address the common problems of the world also indicate ways in which we can think about them. And you're absolutely right that globalism was a term that was very common in its usage in the 1940s. And it's also interesting historically to see where it comes from, who used it first. So as far as I know, the first person to use it was a German scholar called Ernst Jäckh, who had been very, very close to government before the First World War, in the First World War in the 1920s. But he wasn't, he wanted to originally, I think, work with Adolf Hitler, but he couldn't. He fled to the United States, and he wrote a series of books. And in those, he depicted the Nazis as globalist. It's very, very interesting if you think of it at the time. People looked at National Socialism and looked at Stalin's Russia and saw that these were both ideological visions that wanted to extend themselves all over the world. Both Hitler and Stalin had big globes in their offices. They looked at things on, and you probably have seen, your viewers have seen the Charlie Chaplin film, where Charlie Chaplin makes fun of the Nazi leader in the film The Great Dictator, and his version of the Nazi leader bounces up and down on a big globe and plays with this enormous globe. So, this was a negative term. And then it was used, and particularly, I think the very, very powerful, inventive, interesting journalist, Walter Lippmann, used it as a criticism of the United States in the 1940s, and said, the United States mustn't have this globalist vision, and needs to play according to rules, and not think that it can rule the rest of the world. And Lippmann came again and again with that kind of criticism in the 1960s. He had that as an attack on the US engagement in the Vietnam War. So globalism is something different. I don't think anybody likes to be thought of as a globalist. It's a negative term. Whereas globalization, it's gone through variations. It was really popularized in the 90s. Its origins are further back in the 1960s and 1970s. But in the 1990s, it comes to be used to describe an integrated world in which there's big movement of goods and capital and labor and ideas. So everything is moving. And, on the whole, this is a world that has been very successful in the sense that it's taken billions of people out of poverty. So, if we're thinking of the big developments of the last 20 or 30 years, it's the rise of Asia, but also really increased living standards in South America, Latin America, and also now, I think the beginning of globalization in Africa, where incomes are also rising. So again, globalization is something that is transformative, and it really does, I think, live up to that idea of the 1944, 1945 spirit that if you create prosperity everywhere, it's good for the world. And so, you may want to ask why it goes wrong and what happens and why people feel differently. And I think my answer to that is that this is all, in a sense, the fallout from the 2008 financial crisis. And we're still living with the way in which that gets put into the political systems of different countries. And you think then, in the aftermath of that, of politics fundamentally as a zero-sum game. And the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, I think, was interpreted very widely throughout the world as a crisis in the US economy.
Now, it's very interesting the way you describe globalization, because if you look at the definition in the way you describe it, the current period is not the first time the world has experienced globalization. We can look to ancient trade routes, the emergence of active trade in between ancient Greece and the so-called spice exchanges, the Silk Road, all of these phenomena historically facilitated globalization of goods, of communications, and of ideas as well. Historically, there is no public criticism from anyone I've heard that those things should not have happened. And since those ancient days, we've had numerous waves of breakthroughs of globalized communications, globalized transportation routes, railroads, later airplanes, and so forth. And yet, none of those things in themselves garnered criticism. There was criticism in terms of implementation of who's involved and how, but not of the phenomenon itself. By the end of the 20th century, the beginning of 21st, we for the first time are starting to see the criticism of the very aspect of integration of these things. And some of the criticisms I've heard had less to do with the financial crisis of 2008 and more with the outsourcing of jobs from the United States and Europe into Asian and low and developing countries, which essentially allowed a mass cheaper production of goods on the one hand, but also transferred blue-collar jobs and mass production jobs from the West to East. So how is it, though, that instead of focusing on the concrete phenomena of a particular economic nature, there's become this really wide-ranging criticism of any sort of global integration?
Yes, I think you're right. I'm not sure that it's completely new. I think there was something like this in the early 20th century. There was certainly a lot of it in the 1930s, and that's why I tend to think of criticisms of globalization as coming back and back as cycles. What you described correctly in the 1990s, but maybe particularly in the 2000s, is something that has its roots in the past. And it's a question really what sort of globalization you're most worried about. And in all of these phases of pushbacks against globalization, people were worried about trade globalization, and they were worried about the loss of jobs. And for instance, before the First World War, there was an increasing sense in Britain that it was losing its industrial preeminence, and everything was being undercut by cheap goods from Germany. So the Britain-Germany rivalry looked like an anticipation of the US-China relationship. And there are, I think, very, very good analogies. There was a British author, E.E. Williams, who wrote a book called Made in Germany that was an attack on German power. And he begins his book in a very funny way. I mean, it's kind of interesting. He wrote it apparently with a pencil, and then he looked at the pencil, and on the pencil it said "Made in Germany," so you get exactly that kind of phenomenon in the 2000s as well. That we think, well, all the equipment, now I'm talking to you. I'm afraid I can't point at it because I'm talking through it, but I'm talking on a laptop, which is undoubtedly made in China. And so, we have very common objects that we feel are being sourced elsewhere and leading to a loss of jobs at home. But in these periods, there's also a great deal of concern, a great deal of worry about immigration. And one of the most urgent concerns before the First World War in the United States, for instance, was that there were cheaper workers coming in from Asia. A number of states passed Chinese exclusion laws already in the 19th century, but also from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. And so there was pressure in Congress again and again with bills that were only enacted after the First World War in 1920 and 1922 to restrict migration into the United States. And we're seeing exactly that kind of feeling that there's too much migration, and it's in the United States, it's in Europe. It's a very, very powerful driver of politics.
So we are seeing this phenomenon of various terms being essentially jumbled together to create very incoherent ideologies that lump so-called globalists with globalization, with essentially just in general, specific with concerns about border security versus legal immigration, and whether even legal immigration should be restricted due to the potential loss of jobs and so forth, because arguably many of the illegal aliens crossing the border would not be eligible for the same type of jobs that a legal immigrant would. We are talking about somewhat different phenomenon, and a lot of these concerns are more security related than job related, but all of that is being kind of brought together, and various so-called anti-globalist forces or nationalist conservatives, a term that personally gives me somewhat of a pause, they are bringing all these issues under one roof despite the fact that they're separate phenomena. And at the center of all of it is the criticism of international institutions such as IMF, the World Bank, and so forth, claiming that a small group of economic and financial interests and oligarchic business people are essentially looking to seize these international institutions for the sake of power, control, and basically at the expense of the common man. So how do we is it possible to separate all these things? Is it possible to examine this generalized anti-integration ideology? Is it something new, or is it yet another reiteration of those things that you've described in the 1930s? Or are we seeing a somewhat different version of it now?
I think it is very, very similar, actually, quite honestly, to the world of the 1930s. And then there were also international institutions, the League of Nations. The League of Nations had a finance and economic section that, in many ways, in the 1920s had behaved in a way similar to the International Monetary Fund. It gave loans to stabilize countries in order to get out of big problems. But in the 1930s, its authority gets more and more eroded, and it really can't manage the peace process anymore. So it doesn't do the peace part of the indivisible peace and prosperity, and it fails in regard, first of all, to the Japanese attack in Manchuria in 1931. But it fails again and again in dealing with Italy and Abyssinia, dealing with Nazi expansion. So the international institutions are really discredited, and that's why the big push comes to rebuild them in a different way in the post-war era.
There is something interesting that I'm noticing is that increasingly the same voices in leaders and institutions that criticize this international foundation for global cooperation and who are uh, who are criticizing this very framework, whether it's the European Union or NATO or economic institutions, are also somewhat are moving from the specific, criticism of corruption inside these institutions and elitist or sort of supra-federalist policies to criticizing capitalism itself and essentially saying that capitalism itself is a corrupt institution and cannot function and essentially is bound to discriminate against uh, the populations, generally speaking. And I find this very fast evolution in rhetoric fascinating to behold, because there is a huge difference between criticizing specific institutions and criticizing the very economic framework we are talking about. How to explain this very, very fast development from somewhat legitimate criticism or skepticism of implementation of particular policies to this general anti-capitalist move?
Yeah, I mean, I do see exactly what you're thinking about, and again, I think it's not new, and it's particularly at moments that capitalism is transformative, and I think one of the issues is that, and it comes up, I think, in the discussion of globalization, is that globalization and technical change go hand in hand with each other, and they're both disruptive. And you can legitimately fear if you're in a particular occupation that you will lose it as a result of technical change. And so in the 19th century, when the machines were introduced for textile manufacture, the handloom weavers in many countries protest and riot and try to destroy factory equipment, and they sense rightly that they're losing out as a result of the factory development. And I think you can see that if you if you examine the most recent phase of globalization, there's a whole stream of literature that's examined the way in which the impact of Chinese imports in particular areas has led to a loss of jobs, and that those areas are particularly likely to vote for anti-globalist, or sometimes we call them populist political movements. And so you have an explanation, for instance, of the 2016 vote in the United States or the 2016 referendum in the United Kingdom on exit from the European Union that's conducted along those lines. Who is it that is affected by the combination of trade and technology? I mean, it's actually difficult to pick them apart, I think, because the way in which the impact comes is partly by foreign trade, but also one of the features of the last 10 or 15 years has been that a number of processes have been onshored again, moved away from offshoring. But instead of the goods being made by people, they're more and more made by robots. And so the robots are having the same effect as the foreign workers were in the earlier period. And it goes back to what we were talking about right at the beginning. That is that when there's a very, very rapid pace of technical change, you can see that more and more people are going to be frightened about the consequences of the technical change. And so, for instance, journalism, many areas of journalism, business journalism, sports journalism, have been changed fundamentally by AI applications. And it's not there a question of foreign journalists doing the business reporting or doing the sports reporting, but the AI will do it, but it has the same consequence. People are losing their jobs, and they're vulnerable, and they're afraid about the consequences.
Now, would it be fair to say that we are living through a new industrial revolution of sorts, this time driven by AI, automation processes, and greater efficiency in some ways, rather than through railroads and mass production and things of that nature?
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. It's comparable to the big revolutions of the past. You just mentioned railroads and steamships in the middle of the 19th century. They produced a revolution. In the 20th century, electrification produces a similar result in that you can have more widely dispersed production because of the dispersion of electrical power. You don't need to focus around a central provision of energy as you do in the steam-driven technology of the mid-19th century. Yes, I mean this is exactly the kind of disruption that we're facing at the moment. But I think to a great extent, the lesson of history is actually reassuring about this. That is that none of these revolutions really produced an overall loss of jobs. They just produced people moving from one employment to another. And it's clearly painful if you've got a set of skills that are invested in something that reflects the past. You will find it more difficult to go into the technologies of the future. And so, you can hear from my accent probably that I'm originally from the UK, and I grew up in a period in which there was this very, very sharp deindustrialization of the UK, and there were many coal miners, and the coal industry in the UK has basically vanished. Many steel workers greatly reduced, and you couldn't really expect coal miners to go easily into services and to become hairdressers, for instance. So the industries that grew didn't really absorb adequately the workers who were displaced by the technology that was coming in.
Interestingly enough, in the US, we've had somewhat of a similar issue with the coal mines giving way and transitioning to new forms of energy. But this is not the first time this has happened. We had previously major shifts from coal to gas-based economies. Now you're having a more diverse move towards various types of energies, but the coal is clearly, and I think everyone recognizes it, that the coal is the least preferable of energy options, regardless of where anyone stands on anything else. It's obvious that this sector is bound to be replaced by other forms of energy, just as we have seen gas replace coal much of the coal industry earlier on. So the question is, how do we apply these lessons? One of the complaints by major sectors of the people following these outbreaks is that the government and private industry have not been adept in providing an equitable transition for those people from with no skills to train in new skills. I mean, at one point there was a kind of a joke about everyone being encouraged to learn coding instead of coal mining or whatever else that has been um dispensed with and or outsourced. And obviously that is not a trajectory that's a good fit for many people, especially if they're older. But the question is, how do we navigate this time of uncertainty, and what could be done based on past examples that makes it less painful or provides reasonable options in these new times of transitions to new things, whatever they may be.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And, your example is also an interesting one in that, if you had some kind of systemic program that pushed people, unemployed coal miners or unemployed steel workers, to do computer coding, you would have exactly the same issue because, what we're seeing now is that AI is actually producing a lot of coding itself. And so computer coders are one of the groups that I think are most vulnerable at the moment to a new form of displacement. So what do you need? Well, I think the recommendation is clear that the most important thing to have is a high level of education. And one of the sources of great inequity is the very differential provision of education across countries. I mean, including the United States is a particularly poor example of how to provide education for everybody. There are some school districts that work very well, but there are other school districts that don't. Can you be optimistic about this? I think that you can be optimistic in the sense that it's exactly the kind of technology that we're talking about that is going to offer young people in particular, but also people of any age, the opportunity to have high quality lessons of a kind that they couldn't have access to in the past. If you look on the internet at something like the Khan Academy, this is something that is available to anybody all over the world as long as they have a computer access. And it gives a clear and interactive education in many subjects, including the really key STEM subjects, mathematics, that is far superior to that which is offered in many schools. And so, what I see is that schools are going to have to change in order to really emphasize the importance of accessing these new technologies, the importance of being flexible, and much less concerned with the kind of rote learning that schools were concerned with in the past.
No, I think what's interesting about all of this is that ultimately these technological changes bring about new opportunities as much as they dispense with old skills, in that they actually move countries forward and give developed countries more of an edge in terms of producing these new technologies and the new skill sets. The people in the United States and some of the leading European countries, they are actually ultimately at an advantage point because they're at the forefront of that development moment. They're not chasing after the new technologies. China is. It is. It is actually, while it's actually investing a lot, it is highly dependent on US based AI and other phenomena. So to some respect, US is actually at an early point where these skills could be quickly integrated socially and actually give people here this technological industrial advantage point. But we are seeing exactly what you've described at the same time, that some of the new technologies people are simply educationally completely unprepared for. We are seeing a huge gap in semiconductor industry with the shortage of engineers, with jobs not being filled, with people having to find workers from India or other countries, Taiwan, and bringing them over here because there's simply a lack of qualified professionals. So how do we, how do we bring together this understanding of what is actually needed and where the opportunities lie in a way that kind of provides an optimistic vision for people frustrated with their situations and frustrated with the sort of discourse they're hearing from the leadership? Because I'm seeing like this huge kind of there is a disconnect between can be and should be done versus what people think, where it's all heading, and they're not seeing the opportunities necessarily, and they're not seeing where the needs actually lie. They're kind of stuck on the things that they think they should be concerned about.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think indeed, this question of who has access to education, where is it taking place, is fascinating. I'm not sure that I think that the United States or Western Europe has a particularly good advantage there. I think in many ways the tests really reveal that quite a large number of Asian countries do much better on these tests. Actually, also in Europe, really fascinatingly, and maybe one of the legacies of communism that was positive is that Eastern and Southeast Europe have very, very high levels of mathematics education, and still, now obviously over 30 years since the was 40 years since the collapse of communism, but the legacy of that, and what that offers for those countries is the possibility of, as it were, leapfrogging development, and so they can. I mean, this concept of leapfrogging was developed by a brilliant economist, Alexander Gerschenkron, born in Odessa, so in the Russian Empire before the First World War, but moved in the end to Harvard. And he was always concerned with how countries can not just catch up, but actually can overtake if they have the right mental outlook. And that was a great concern. And I think you can see, your question about the shortages of many of these possible applications in the United States. Well, you can substitute for that. So software development. It's not just in the United States. It's in Ukraine is actually a good example of where there was a lot of software development, but in Serbia, in former Yugoslav Republic of North Macedonia, in Israel, in Asia, it's something that you can do anywhere, and it's actually an interesting phenomenon in terms of the globalization pattern, that there are people who are working in many countries who are working for foreign firms, and so they're paid in euros or in dollars, and in a way outside the local economy, but they're working on applications that are usable internationally.
No, that's, we're looking at these tensions at this level, industrial level of economic dissatisfaction and concern about the future and uncertainty, and certainly these sort of times are exactly the times when demagoguery can prevail and easily, hijack legitimate efforts to create some sort of a path forward and to protect people from the excesses of the rapid speed of development, and quite frankly, lean into protectionist policies that are anti-competitive and hold everyone collectively back. But there is another concern, which is how do we separate the legitimate criticisms of the international institutions, these governing bodies and multilateralist practices, from the efforts of hegemonic states and policies from trying to hijack these institutions in their own favor. And I think this is where these so-called anti-globalists, they have a legitimate concern, but they use it illegitimately. The fact of China's misuse of WHO, this is not, and the cover up of all of it brought many people to the criticism of these institutions. That doesn't mean, however, that these institutions should not exist. They have at one point served at least a partial purpose in bringing together a consensus, a discussion forum, and an exchange of ideas. So how do we separate this corruption or hijacking of institutions from their legitimate role? What can be done to prevent this from happening?
Well, I think you're thinking primarily of the WTO, and the WTO plays a big role in, or potential role in, dealing with trade disputes, and there are going to be more and more trade disputes, and as we slip more into protectionism. So, the question, is a subsidy illegitimate or not? And that can be dealt with by arbitration panels of the WTO, but the WTO has got stuck on that because the United States fundamentally stopped appointing judges on the arbitration panels. And I mean, this is indeed absolutely central, and I think you just need new initiatives to restart that process. But of the international institutions that you mentioned, the WTO is in a way the most vulnerable. The World Bank and the IMF have a rather different mission, and they're not really trying to arbitrate in disputes. In that sense, they're not as vulnerable to this anti-globalist backlash as the WTO is.
Interestingly enough, this whole concept of free trade, is again being kind of criticized because some players engage in abusive practices, dumping of goods and stealing of intellectual property and so forth. Again, those are legitimate criticisms, but they are aimed at particular actors and particular abuses. So how do we separate the specific from the general? How do we understand, that this is actually the opposite of the old saying, don't hate the player, hate the game, but rather this is actually the case of where you should be criticizing the players and not the game. Players
Yeah,
trying to rig the game, but not necessarily the game being wrong in itself.
I mean, there are a number of issues. I mean, I think first of all, yes, the question of subsidies, so that is an industry selling at dumping prices in order to destroy other industries and then get a hegemonic position in the market. But I think you've also got discussions of labor standards, discussions of environmental standards that come into exactly that discussion. And so you don't want, for instance, to have goods imported that come at a very high environmental cost in some other country, and so that's an area where this question of redefining how you talk about trade disputes is going to be essential.
There is also seems to be a clash of interest. We're seeing, any movement is going to have its activists who are pushing the highest possible standard in this particular movement vis-a-vis other concerns. We have seen, if you're a hammer, everything will look a nail. If you're an environmentalist, your biggest concern is going to be the environment. If you're an economist, your greatest concern is going to be the financial outlook and the economic impact of whatever the other policies are. And if you're a health professional, obviously public health is going to be your number one priority. So what I have seen from the recent crisis, whether it was the handling of the pandemic, the farmers' protests about ESG standards or other, phenomena, is this disbalance in the discussion, in the priorities, and in the attempt to balance the impact of these clashing, conflicting interests and goals and objectives vis-a-vis what constitutes the public good. So how do we discuss what the public good is and what it should be, given all these different criteria that have now emerged as areas of concern, and none of them are completely legitimate. All of them have areas of concern, but they impact different groups of people in different ways. Some benefit from these policies, others will inevitably be affected negatively. How do we create a public good that's actually public and not does not create oligarchies?
Yeah, I'm absolutely right. I mean, I think the answer is the more open a system is, the less it's likely to protect oligarchs. And oligarchs characteristically flourish in countries that have rare natural resources where you can control the natural resource and then extract a rent from that kind of control. And so, sort of characteristically, if you take a country that has very little in the way of natural resources like Japan, you don't really get oligarchs being formed in Japan, whereas oil-producing states are on the other end of the spectrum, and there you can see that you don't have to do anything. You just sit and let the oil gush out of the ground, and you control the rent. So in general, the more open something is, and the more alternatives we have, the less we find oligarchs in control. And I think indeed, this is one of the central issues of the time, because we're in the middle of a carbon transition. We're moving away from oil. Countries that are big oil producers, oil or gas producers, see that they have only a really relatively limited number of years in which they can exert their influence, and so they want to do that now, and they're pushing to do that now.
Interestingly enough, obviously, the more money you make from somewhere, the more you have to invest in other industries. So the same entrenched interests that are benefiting from these natural resource domination monopolies are able to extend their influence to other unrelated areas simply because they can. They have the resources to do that. So this creates this sort of, resentment, imbalance, and zero-sum playing that you've mentioned in the very beginning. So now zooming back out into this discussion of zero-sum approach to resolution of global crisis and global phenomena, how do we break through this very easy approach that benefits, quite frankly, any politician? Nobody wants to speak nuance. Everyone wants to provide an easy solution, and more into something a practicable framework that may not be as popular and as seemingly easy, but is more comprehensive, more inclusive of different stakeholders' interests, and more durable and sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, well, that's where maybe this is the silver lining that you're looking for. The aftermath of big geopolitical conflicts does tend to produce exactly this kind of calculation that you can't go on doing what you've done in the past. You need to have a more inclusive discussion. You need to have new institutions. You need to be more accessible. You need to explain yourself more. And in a sense, this is what the world did in 1944, 1945. But that's a system that was in a very different world, and so we may think that we should be rethinking many of those approaches to international organization and international rule.
Now, it's interesting. One example that you used in the article was the second Moroccan crisis of 1911 and the French-German tensions that came about as a result. And now we're actually seeing some of the same players engage in some of the same economic rivalries, albeit the approach is more peaceful than what we have seen back in the day. And some of these old, economic and political issues are seen as kind of repeating themselves in a renewed cycle, in a different way perhaps, but nevertheless, some of these things still exist. At the time, uh, you mentioned the rapid sell of securities. Now we are seeing other economic responses. Why have sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same. So why have certain practices persisted over time despite clear lessons from history, and what has actually changed as a result of these past failures and limitations?
Well, what I was thinking about, indeed, in the article was the way in which, as tensions escalate, as countries think that they're more and more likely to engage in war with each other, that they use financial means, and in particular, they try to trigger financial crises on the other side in order to get more power. And so, you know, I think if you think of a world that wants prosperity, then you need to think of ways of eliminating financial crises because they're disruptive. If you think that you're in a world which is competitive, you think that a financial crisis, as long as it affects the other side, is a good idea. And so that was the story that I was telling in the lead up to the First World War and in the lead up to the Second World War, where both sides are really trying to destabilize each other. And the question is how much of that can or might occur today. And what I found fascinating was this now celebrated television interview between President Putin and Tucker Carlson. And most people commented on how Putin was thinking about thousands of years of Russian history and the baptism of St. Vladimir or St. Vladimir. But what I found fascinating was the shorter part of the interview where he was discussing the American debt. And he says 33 trillion. And the American debt is the foundation of American power. But it's only the foundation of American power as long as the rest of the world accepts it. And once you get a crisis of confidence, you lose that entirely. And so, it was actually a very stunning statement that the US dollar is more important for United States power than the nuclear weapon is. What that clearly was supposed to indicate was, this might not be so stable.
And that brings me to the key point of the discussion, which is this economic warfare that we are seeing. It may not be fully visible, and some of the concerns are a little bit, exaggerated, but the fact that there is this balance and it's at a point of potential disruption for both internal and external reasons, that is not, I think, in doubt by anyone seriously. Many have pointed to BRICS as a potential source of concern for the US. De-dollarization, circumvention of sanctions, separate reorganization of economic alliances per se, even without this devaluation of currency that there, and on the other hand, high inflation rates, overspending, sort of irresponsible fiscal policies from larger powers such as the United States that put it at risk of losing businesses to competitors who are cheaper. We are talking about the shipping industry shifting to economies that appear to be more protected from geopolitical risks than, rather than being targets of geopolitical threats. So what we are seeing this potential effort to kind of realign these economic interests from Western-based order to other combinations of actors. Let me put it. Not all of them are, non-Western, but most are. So how do we balance this sort of active economic warfare with policies that actually strengthen general global confidence, even despite these tensions?
Well, I mean, I think part of the discussion is also dangerous and misleading in the sense that one of the things that, for instance, that particular interview brings up is the idea that there's a kind of rest of the world that is united against the Old West, against the North Atlantic, against France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and so on. But it's just not right. To think that India and China are on the same side is absolutely insane. They have very, very substantial differences. They've been locked in a really brutal and often deadly border dispute for decades. This is not an alliance of the global South that is replacing an old West. It's a messier world, and as you say, I think a messier world needs a rule-based system, but it needs a system that is perceived to be legitimate and perceived to be just.
So where do we find that balance? How do we revitalize such a system in the absence of consensus and in the rise of populist movements? And I wouldn't say that populism is always 100% bad or there's no legitimate cause for concern about those people, but primarily from what I have seen historically, it does not provide active solutions. It provides spite-based kind of rebellion against the status quo, but not necessarily as a new path, a better path forward.
Well, right. I mean, I think then if you look at the odd obsession of so-called populists, either in the United States or in Europe, with Russia and with a kind of adulation of Vladimir Putin because he's thought to be defending traditional values or something like that. I mean, when you look in more detail and you see the incompetence, the inefficiency, the massive loss of human life, as well as the political repression, this gets less and less attractive. And so I think, in a sense, there's a verdict of history that comes out, and it means that people who want to hitch their fortunes politically to such a destructive force see that the basis of their illusions will vanish.
Is there a way to walk back from this economic warfare, especially if one of the sides is not particularly willing, or if that economic warfare is parcel of the geopolitical vision? And if so, how do you de-escalate at least some of the tensions with some of the actors and bring them over to a more cooperative framework, or at the very least not bring them over to the other side?
Right. So first of all, how do you defend yourself against these financial crises? You need to become more resilient. You need to have sustainable policies. You can't have policies where the long run is unsustainable. So, that's what one side needs to do. And the other side, I think, has actually no future. And so, when that fact is realized, you will get the preparation for a very different kind of negotiation in a different kind of world. So, in our historical example, the Nazi way of organizing society, the state, the economy, was completely discredited in 1945, and so that is the foundation for a new world. And it's the failure, the discrediting of alternatives that I think will lay the basis for a better and more sustainable future development.
So you're predicting that before things get better, they are going to get worse. We are going to have this geotechnopolitic driven kind of financial war of attrition, and we will see a greater disruption of global cross-border supply chains and attempted restrictive policies. But at the same time, today we are far more integrated and interdependent economically than we were in those periods of time you're discussing. So what is the new reality that we will have to come to grips with? How is how are these, is there a greater stake at avoiding the exacerbation of this crisis? Is that even possible at this particular juncture?
Well, the mechanism is actually stunningly similar, and I, was fascinated by the choice of words that you just made, because that sentiment was put in almost exactly those words, that things have to get better before they can become, I'm sorry, things have to get worse before they can get better, was exactly the phrase that the great British economist John Maynard Keynes had in the chaos after the First World War in 1919. Things have to get worse before they can get better. But you see, I think, very, very quickly, when there are shortages today, when countries try to use some kind of control of their access to supplies as a way of putting pressure on the other countries, you very, very quickly get a response, because we're flexible. We think of alternatives. So there were big shortages, for instance, of cobalt a year or so ago. Now the cobalt price has gone through the floor. Russia tried to use energy as a way of blackmailing Europe. The energy price has fallen. You think of alternatives, you get alternatives, and that kind of fundamental inventiveness is the answer to people who use supply constraints.
It's interesting that despite the fact that the policies that have led to the crisis to begin with, are duly criticized for their short-sightedness, at the same time, the very same voices who were criticizing that and panicking over what might happen if Europe and were to divest from Russian energy sources are nowhere to be heard when in fact that actually happens fairly quickly too. So perhaps there is more cause for optimism than anyone is willing to acknowledge, because fundamentally free societies do tend to have more freedom to also be inventive and to come up with better options and diverse solutions than rigid structures that are self-isolated and restrictive.
I completely agree with that.
Well, that was a very fascinating overview of past and present. I think a lot of people tend to learn very simplified and even wrong lessons from past history. They notice the phenomenon, but not the ultimate resolution. And there's a big comparison between the 1920s and the know-nothings and the political populism of those days and isolationism, and there's a natural criticism saying that US now is a global power. Should it turn isolationist, it cannot, it can no longer play the same role in the world. But there is a more fundamental question, which is that isolationism will ultimately backfire and hurt the very same people calling for it precisely because of the nature of the way economy works. Precisely because it will provide US with fewer options for its economic, competitiveness, for its trade, and for the very dominance that gives it its very advantage. And the part where that was not working out and was holding US back, that's the part that I think is missing from the discussion today.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and providing this fascinating view of these issues that I think many people are not quite as familiar with, and they don't necessarily stop to think about. And I think there is, despite the seeming, extreme reactions and clashes at this point in time, I think the answer is not in zero-sum game. I think the answer is in nuance. The answer is in the how, not in the whether or not. And I think this duality will pass once better leadership on all fronts, intellectually, not just politically, emerges that can provide the how and can provide a framework that will bring interests together rather than push them apart. And for those watching the program, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. And of course, we'll be back next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as usual. Thank you for joining us today and have a great night.
Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting.